Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. This week's drawing is another environment speed paint since, well, I had planned to maybe trial something else and something new this week, and then this idea just sort of happened, and in truth, my other ideas will still need more time before I can pursue them much further. And then here we are. Another environment speed paint of something that almost claimed a life of its own and kind of found its own purpose the more that I worked on it and the further that it progressed. You see, getting straight into the drawing without any sense of delay, I only began sketching this as a sort of warm-up, so to speak of, whilst also considering other ideas and trying to distract myself, whilst also working out how I will go about making those other ideas happen. I wasn't really focused or set on any one idea, and I had been more doodling designs for a range of ideas, projects and themes, and those were all that I want to develop and explore further. At the same time as all of this, I was also messing with tools, and really just using this as a way of keeping my hands busy, whilst thinking through different projects at the moment, and trying to just determine what the next steps for them all would be, and working out how I want things to go from here. As a part of this, I was messing with the decoration tools and seeing all the types of flowers in it, and also messing with the way that the repeating brushes like a fence would work. I wanted to see how the lights were going, and what could be done with them, as I almost forget what is in that section sometimes. Now, as part of this, it also got me looking at the sections that I never really touch either, and that's mainly because I never really need to work them out, such as the text bubble area that is meant for comics and, near it, a section dedicated to various rulers that can be added to layers. Now, I don't do comics, so I don't normally have to work out the text bubbles, but they were fun to just kind of mess around with at moments like this. The important one here were the rulers, actually, because this section ranges from basic straight line tools to perspective rulers that could come in handy later. But the most relevant to this sketch and this process was the symmetry ruler, where I can add up to 16 different mirroring lines. I started my experiments with it on a lot of lines. I think I used the full 16, just kind of using it to make different circular patterns that I figured might be useful for magic effects sometime soon, as it is something I've been avoiding for the symmetry element that I want to do more with. Though after I doodled enough patterns, I wanted to see if maybe I could use this for a particular situation, where the drawing I'm doing has an element or the entire thing is meant to be perfectly identical on either side of something, or if I would still need to flip everything myself after drawing half, as I wanted to see which would be the better outcome, as currently I have just been copying and pasting everything after flipping it. I then figured that what better way to test this than to sketch this sort of window that I've been avoiding for this very reason. It may seem like a bit of an odd choice. Normally, I would instead look towards ideas like a flower, since they're fun to doodle and simple enough to get the hang of with this tool. Yet, I've always liked how these windows look, and there is something appealing in their symmetry that I can never quite match or perfect otherwise. I also figured that sketching windows like this would be a useful thing to be able to do, as I've been wanting to tie this style into a project at the moment, and have wanted to include it in the world building as I work on new areas of my fantasy world, with various eras of their history to cover especially. Though again, with me not being able to make them symmetrical, they've always looked a little bit off. So, whilst thinking of plots for many stories, other video ideas, and who knows what else I came up with, I sketched quite a few different window designs and different options. I had some that were simple with no arches, yet details in the narrower gaps, and some that were more complex. I had those with large layers of arches of pillars and all sorts in the space, and more details in the glass depicting scenes. I wanted to kind of look at all sorts of complexity that may still be achieved in this design, and kind of really explore what could be done if I did use this as a sort of appearance for part of the world building, which also meant considering what the windows would tell of the world and the people around it. Yes, as part of the sketches, this idea just kind of happened. I began this idea wanting something in the middle of what I had at that point, as I have a character in this region of the world that I am developing in the background, and I wanted to use them as a reference point for this detail, just so in the world building I can kind of anchor towards the ideas of the windows and the people, and tie it all in together. I have an idea of their rank and status in the world, so what they can attain or would be around normally could then help me get a sense and shape for the design ideas of those around them too. What would be more fancy, what would be less fancy, and what would people realistically be looking at? Then, before I knew it, I had this sketch. Or, well, the window portion of it. It just kind of happened too, and I realised that, somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to solve my other ideas and problems and had instead started working on developing this sketch into something workable with a connection to my Noctovia project. And then at that point, I just didn't fight it either. I mean, I had two options. One, I went back to doodling and insisted that I resolved the issues I set out to. In all of this, I had points to note down for those drawings and things to develop on later, yet I wasn't close to any sort of solution, and I would likely need a few more hours to come to one, or come to any. Option 2 was to take a break and step back. I could do this, and then come back to those issues later when I had a fresh outlook, and I wasn't trying to force anything. I also knew that, if anything, I would likely come up with a solution when I wasn't trying to, since I have been doing that quite a bit lately. So this all means that I let myself go ahead with this drawing, and I decided that I would develop this sketch as a drawing itself overall, unrelated to anything. Though at this point I had the character in mind, but the window was otherwise empty and missing any kind of interest. It was only when I knew that I would approach this drawing as its own serious thing that I figured about adding the character to the window, as if they were practicing magic or doing something in the room with their back to the camera, as it were. Even then there was a bit of a debate about including this character, or what I'm tying to this character at the moment, but there's more on that later. I really haven't settled on this character's overall design, it is worth noting. So I kind of just combined the elements of the ones that I like into this, and figured that I could solve the design issues later when I actually work with this character in a more serious manner. I do want to clarify that this drawing may have begun with ties to the fantasy project, yet it wasn't strictly being enforced, given the fact that this character is still very early, and it's still very undecided yet. I have very little ironed out with them, and I don't even have a personality worked out so far, or, to be fair, the events that shape their experiences or outlook. This is the very long way of saying that they're very much in the concept phase, where everything is viable to change. So for all of this, I made this drawing as its own thing without any strings attached. I added the person to the window as it looked nice, not because I'm developing this character any further or cementing any ideas about them. It just so happens that the early sketch was influenced by the world building I have done, and it was intended to see how a design element may have worked whilst also being a bit of a visual reference for later problems really. Now though, enough of the sketch as we can move into discussing the details. I mean, I would normally talk about the colour palette here, yet this time saw it being fairly straightforward in terms of process, where I just picked the colours I liked, and some that worked better with the stone and leaf impression since it fit. I wanted the bushes to be a natural green, and it made sense that the stone would be grey for now too, with the blue and purple sitting well with this, and the yellow accents just brought it all together. I mean, the palette is one that I often use, and it kind of worked itself out as it's no way revolutionary for my work. All of that being said though, the first detail that I actually want to discuss is the window itself. More specifically the top portion to it first and foremost, as this was the section I arguably had the most fun with when working on it all. But before I touch on the design specifically, I want to actually talk about the brushes used in it for a moment. Now, last week I made a video where I used the brushes that I rarely use and kind of made myself trial some that I wouldn't otherwise think of, with the goal to get familiar with new brushes, and that was mainly so I could do things that I wouldn't think of otherwise. One of them was the round and flat watercolour brushes, which, as I kind of stated last time, were ones that I avoided due to the harsh edge that they had, and due to them being ones that I normally didn't even think of, as I barely knew they existed. Yet this time I remembered that I could turn off this harsh edge for the layered effect and the layered areas, and I could kind of customise how the brush behaved via the settings each tool allows. It was kind of relevant this time as I knew that I didn't need to avoid it for disliking one thing about the brush, or having one trait to the brush that meant it was harder to use. So this time, when it coming up to the stained glass, I kind of let myself experiment by using this brush without the harsh edge, since I thought the effect would benefit from a subtle texture to the areas, and the brushes were translucent on their normal settings, which meant I wouldn't be relying on reducing the opacity of another layer. To be a little bit clearer in my explanations there, as I think I've just confused myself as well, I would usually approach glass and stained glass by just lowering the opacity of a normal layer, and then use any other brush to fill in the space. This means that the shading is often less noticeable, and there isn't really much that I can do when I'm thinking about lighting and overall effects. 9 times out of 10, this method also doesn't look a whole lot like glass either. This time I just kind of let the brush do the work. And yes, I did lower the opacity of the layer at a later stage, but not the main detail layer, if that makes sense. I only lowered the opacity of the base layer with the paler pink on it, since I felt that it shifted attention too much and it didn't sit right with the colours around it anyway. I didn't need it to be so noticeable. Yet for the patterns, I kept it as just these brushes and let them create the translucent effect that could be shaded and detailed like anything else, especially with the highlights added to it as well. It is worth noting that I actually had an easier time on the pattern shapes in the design, as they weren't on low opacity compared to the background of it, where the highlights don't really show up on the base layer compared to the patterns. All of this is the long way of saying that I will be exploring this brush further in the future to see if I can do normal glass with it as well, or if I would use it only on stained glass instead. But I also like the texture for this specific drawing, as it helped the section stand out against what is otherwise rather busy. And it also isn't a strict thing for this brush either. I can quite easily use other transparent brushes for glass in the future, or lower the opacity in the brush's settings rather than the layer settings, and kind of just play around with that. But really that's something developed and learnt from this drawing. Now then though, as for the design itself, I went with this as I wanted something pretty simple but also decorated and unique. I don't know if that makes much sense. Yet I wanted it to look like these windows are easy to replicate across a building if needed, whilst also showing some degree of status through the glass details. Especially in terms of the detail, shape and symmetry, as I imagine that it would require quite a few skilled craftsmen to complete something like this, just as a point of world building as well. This pattern kind of filled all those boxes. There were curves and points, pillars and a slight railing too. Yet there were then mirrored circles with symmetrical patterns that would have taken attention to detail. In all of this, the flowers were something I like to draw. Something on my mind from a painting I'm starting, yet also the central pattern is something repeated and mirrored that could also tie into the family or the flower motif, if that's something that I want to change as I look more into this. For now though, in this drawing, I was more working with it as a sense of an eye-catching detail, where I could tie in the colours to the character and make a point of the symmetry that this all started as. I wasn't really thinking too much of the family or values or motifs and such for that. This was really a detail that was for this drawing and this drawing alone. And really, it was even more of an eye-catching detail once I added the shading and such, just to really finish off that section. The rest of the window was then a fairly simple choice, and it came together with very little fuss. I knew that I would want a central pillar to break up the shape, as it would also support the arches that would then section off the higher half to give it something as a visual anchor. The arch keeps these areas separate, and almost acts as a barrier between a functional window and the decorative aspects at the top. They were also added as a visual support to make sense of why the windows weren't going to fall, and why these two little windows are there in the top design. I didn't really start off with the central pillar, and it did look like it was going to fall for quite some time. Besides all of that, it was a detail that I consistently liked from the references of this style of window. It just looked nice to have the arches as a rounder shape, that then partnered with the circles present, whilst I could then contrast this and bring the window to a sort of point that made space for the details. The pillar itself became one of three, giving the window a sense of support and visually giving everything that little bit of sense compared to it not being there. The final detail I actually added to the window and this space was then the low railing at the base, as I figured it brought that section together that little bit more, and, just for my own want, gave me something to spiral the plants across it in the outcome later. From a logical standpoint, I imagine it would be a safety feature too, as I doubt there is glass in the lower section, as I did purposely choose not to draw it to avoid obscuring the character more than I needed to. Though that is something I'm also looking at in terms of the world building, when I'm accounting for seasons and such. I may very easily change my mind of glass's presence in this style though, but for now it wasn't there, and the railing was to kind of make up for that detail, just to kind of maybe stop people falling out. It was then doing too much for me to remove it, balancing the detail in the bottom half with the top, and also continuing some of the shapes through the diamonds that are seen in the top half to the bottom. So it actually looked like a single window someone purposely designed for the building, rather than a detailed top half and a random bottom half. Now though, let's look at the other details around this piece. I want to discuss the characters here since they were interesting to work with, to say the least, since I didn't exactly plan to do something like this so soon in their concept. I've touched on it before in other videos, but usually when I'm making a character, I work out their story first, and anything that is central to their being. For an example of this, if they had a rough childhood, and maybe would have scars to show for it, I will normally need to know that in the design phase, and then I can work out from their personality how much they highlight or hide them. If they're a refined character who has a background of luxury and comfort, I will likely find hints of this in their design, whether it be how they carry themselves or how they have accents of finer decorations. It will all usually influence something about them, so it's quite useful to know where they are from and where they are now when making a design. I mean, even if a character has no hint to their past and background, it can say things about them, whether they have cut ties to it, don't regard it, or if fate has forced them to do it this way instead. For this character, I don't really have an idea as to where they are now and what their goals would be in the story around them. It's certainly unusual development compared to how I usually go about it all, since I have the gist of a story that may unfold in this part of the world that I kinda have built for, but I've very little as to what would shape this character in particular. I have multiple routes that I can take for the time being, and especially when they'd be alive for the story, there's many ways that their behaviours, personality and such can kind of turn events. Basically at the moment everything is very much malleable, and it's very open, really depending on which route I take it. Their personality would decide the story I tell, as I arguably know more about the side characters around them, but even calling the other characters side characters is done with quotations, as they really have their own things going on and their own plots. This is all a really long way of saying that I'm rather far from where I would usually start designing the character's appearance from. If anything, I would actually regard any of their sketches as more general ideas for any character or wider use, as there's nothing in stone for this one, and I've already changed direction a fair few times. It's more likely that I use elements of this design on others or at later points on those around them, as this character is really depending on my want at the moment and need. I think if I had to actually say that I'm designing this character, it would be more accurate to say that I'm working on the visuals of this world's area, and kind of seeing how that will later influence the design. All of this made me wonder though whilst drawing if I was actually drawing this character I thought of, or if this figure would then be someone else. The answer to that is still unknown, so unfortunately I can't offer an answer about it, and my lack of ideas meant I was more interested in putting together a character around the ideas I liked so far, whether it is the nameless one I thought of, or someone new entirely. Or whether in the end, as I've said, they even tie into that world, or they just exist in this single image. It wasn't without reason. The character in the story would be active, and the shorter capelet would make more sense with the way that they would be moving and the environment that they'd be in. I don't believe that this particular thing would be a cloak meant for warmth, so the shorter length is suitable for this case. In the same breath, the corset style is something I've looked at a lot in this world, and it would be suited for these ranks and her currently assumed status. I mainly let it differ by having it tie in the back at the same time rather than the front tying ones that I've worked on quite a few times with this world. Now, given her status as well, I don't believe that she would carry much, and it would be more sensible if they had older style pockets in these sorts of dresses. The style where the pockets tied below the skirt. Yet I wanted to add a small bag to their side for essentials that they'd carry. It wouldn't be much at this moment of development, yet it is a practical nod that I will likely tie into others I design, or maybe a different character overall. This is to say that, yes, I had some logic with this character when I was drawing them, but it wasn't really anything from personality. I was instead making these choices from the world, like the weather and the environments that they'd exist within. After all, if I was going strictly off the character that I have in mind, the character I have to just keep referring to as a character as I don't even have a name for them yet, I would most likely remove the bag of anything. Their story would see it better used for other design features like the pockets, or it would be assumed that someone else would carry things for them if the need arose. Again, everything is very early in development, and it's why I speak more of the idea of someone than a solid character. I can't even really offer elements of plot, since that is all shifting still with the characters I develop, and I only have some points laid out here and there from the other characters I'm also working on around her, and that's really to fit their stories and their narratives. For all I know, she may be the one to end up a side character after all of this planning is done. Yet that still brings us into the final detail of this drawing that I want to touch on. I know I haven't touched on the plants and the book, which should mean I cover them both, yet the book and the magic was more included to make it clear what she was doing. It was an activity, and the floating book is something that makes it very apparent she's working on some skill with the lights around it. There isn't much to say about it that wouldn't expand on what I've already said, or what can be inferred from the drawing. So I want to focus on the bushes and the branches instead around the window, since I relied a lot on them for the framing of this drawing. And in development, I settled on this overgrown appearance long before I added the person. I settled on the greenery as a non-negotiable detail before looking at the character as I liked the environment it built. So, as I said, the window design and the drawing stemmed from ideas about architecture in this region of my fantasy world. I won't really say which part of the world it is just yet, but it's one where this style of window allows me to introduce interesting details to the fantasy world that kind of sets it apart from what would be typically expected, whilst also building on areas of their society and ideals. Now, why am I going on about this again? Well, I have covered the window already, yet this style of architecture is meant to fit into an established environment. I have a vague idea of what the world would look like in different regions, or what this area would expect, so I was drawing and designing to fit into this as well. This region and kingdom of the world is rather green, and at this point it's likely to be filled with forests and fields or relative environments that flourish rather easily. So with the window design, I wanted areas that the bushes would cling to and wrap around, where I could introduce moss and climbing plants to it with ease. I didn't want the architecture to stand away from the natural environment, and I wanted to explore if I could tie these two things together in subtle ways, whilst also using it to frame the image. This is also something I'll be exploring further in later designs and ideas. It's definitely not something I've got fully worked out, and the appearance of it might change entirely. Yet, for now, it worked out and it kind of gives me an idea of how this would work together. Now, the framing from a drawing standpoint was something away from everything else. I figured it would make more sense and be a bit more appealing if I used the plants in this manner, as it guides towards the centre and shows where the climbing plants are from. The wilder bushes around match the hanging ones on the frame, and, if anything, it added a little bit of contrast to it all whilst tying it together. By this, I mean that the window itself is detailed, and it's part of the architecture that wouldn't be seen all over the place, yet it also isn't the fanciest it could be. You wouldn't really see it walking down the street, but it's not the best and the most breathtaking thing of the world. There is a degree of modesty to the window, as it isn't massive or overly detailed, and it does its job while still being a sign of the family status, with the details present if it were across multiple of them in the home. Yet there are also the plants growing and hanging from it, while still being in sight. They've not been removed or taken away, if that makes sense. This part kind of implies that the bushes are close, possibly even climbing up the side of the house intentionally or not. If the leaves on the windows aren't then these bushes, but these bushes are further away, then there are still plants growing and almost claiming the detail of this status that, if I act on it later, could be a sign of other things around the family as well. Again, for now, it simply looked nice and it was interesting, but it could be applied to so many things overall that I simply had to keep them. Not to mention that it also worked really well to have these straight lines and symmetrical shapes that were then taken over by the natural and less predicted and less planned natural forms. In this idea, the flowers made it look somewhat intentional though as well. They're not on the bushes on purpose, and it makes it look more as if these vines on the window were introduced by someone, and that these plants are there by design. Again, maybe tying into the values of the family if I take that route. Yet also indicates that the framing plants aren't that close to the house if it's just an image. They might be further away as if someone's looking over, or it's just a frame to the events inside the window if need be. My choice for drawing, it just drew attention to the centre that bit better, whilst also adding in the natural shapes that I wanted compared to the strict ones of the window. Again though, for all that I've talked about this, I enjoyed the wilder look it took on, and it felt that it was more alive for it. I kept adding to it when sketching, and it did feel lively and framed the piece rather well when I had considered everything. I have a lot to work out for the character, region and story, but I would say that this took me at least a little bit closer to working out everything overall, even if only by a step or two. This drawing was successful though in all fronts that it took on. And I didn't plan what it would do, I didn't plan what it would help me work out or what it would help me develop. Yet somehow it was still successful in everything that it looked at. In terms of a drawing on its own, I like how lively it can feel and the details I could include considering that I didn't really plan this one out so much. I enjoyed working on it and I managed to include a few of the bushes that I said I wanted to incorporate more when I worked last week. And on top of that, I realised how to use a symmetry ruler, and that is a very viable option going forward for anything that I decide to use it for. And I kind of realised there are a lot of ways I can customise it too and use it. In terms of a development piece for the Noctovia project and the ideas tied to that, it didn't sort anything out in full. I don't think I've said a single time that I worked something entirely out from this character to the world or the environment. Yet it worked to give me a lot to think about, and kind of a point to branch out from, and a visual reference that I can refer back to bring back these questions if I forget them. I have more of an idea visually for this world, and maybe some interesting mechanics that I can sneak into the stories here and there, to kind of gradually develop this world with depth that I'm trying to make, just beyond the obvious or stating everything outright. Even if I use nothing of the character, I have parts of the world to work from, and I know what styles I'm now looking at with some ideas of others to combine with it to give it an interesting effect. In general terms, this drawing is still its own thing. It gave me ideas before answers, and it means that I don't really tie this into that other project all the way. There are hints of it in little aspects here and there, but it's not 100% that project. But it was something I had fun with, and I got to look at these details in these brushes more. I got to almost distract myself with it and use this as a setback from other things that I can return to later. And I can really return to those other questions and issues unrelated to any of this with a clearer mind thanks to this project. Well, drawing. I will also say here before we wrap up fully that I got to go back to those original doubts and issues once I sorted everything, and I did manage to come up with a few solutions to them. Some ideas came to me whilst I worked on this, and I had to kind of stop drawing at points to note them down. Hence why there may be longer pauses in this time lapse compared to normal. And there were also others that I had to kind of sit down and fully think through afterwards, or on the evenings after I'd worked on this drawing across a few days. But despite everything that I have said today, I would say that I am ready to face the issues caused by those solutions that I found, and to kind of keep developing these projects and ideas that I might have been ignoring up until this point. With all of that said though, we are out of time for today. I know I skipped over a lot of the details or I got rambling about things disconnected from my point at a few times, but I really did enjoy every part of this drawing, even if it wasn't so planned. Now, I hope you enjoyed watching and have a wonderful day. But for now, goodbye!